Welcome students to this presentation on verbs. Make sure that you take out a piece of paper and that you write your notes from everything you learned from this presentation. It must be in the Cornell notes format, or you can make a thinking map like a bubble map. All of this is due for homework tomorrow. You will be getting a homework stamp for your notes that you take on this presentation. Everything that we're going to be learning today is on verbs, and you can find more information, practice, and all of the definitions in your Holt handbooks on page 48 through 58. So, we're going to be learning about action verbs, helping verbs, linking verbs, transitive verbs, and intransitive verbs. We're going to be learning about all of these different types of categories for the concept of verbs. So what is a verb? I know that most of you guys already know what a verb is because we learned it in the 5th grade and in elementary school. But just to refresh our memories, a verb is a word that expresses action or a state of being. So here's an example. We went to the Discovery Science Center last December. Went is the verb in that sentence because it expresses action. Here's another example. Is Mendez Fundamental the best school ever? Of course it is. And what is the verb in that sentence? If you're thinking that the verb is, then you are correct. Is the verb in that sentence because it expresses a state of being. Remember, a verb doesn't just express action, but it also expresses a state of being. In some sentences, a single word is all that is needed for the verb. For example, the dog barked all night. So barked it would be the only verb in that sentence. However, in other sentences, you need more than one word for the verb. So if you look in the light purple box, in other sentences, the verb consists of a main verb and one or more helping verbs. For example, the dog will bark all night. In this sentence, our verb isn't just all by itself. It's not just bark, it's will bark. For example, I should have started my homework earlier is another example that has helping verbs. Many students can speak Spanish. So you see in that first example, will bark is our verb phrase with the helping verb will. Should have started is the entire verb phrase. Can speak is the entire verb phrase. So in that first verb phrase, will bark, will, which is circled in or actually boxed in yellow, is the helping verb because it helps the main verb bark. In the second example, should have started is the entire verb phrase, and should have becomes the helping verb because they help the main verb started. Can is also the helping verb in the next example because it helps the verb speak. So can speak is the entire verb phrase, can becomes the helping verb, speak becomes the main verb. Here are some other commonly used helping verbs. We have am, are, be, been, being, can, could, did, do, does, had, has, have, is, may, might, must, shall, should, was, were, will, would. It's probably a good idea to make sure that you look at these commonly used helping verbs because these are the most commonly used helping verbs that you're going to be seeing when you read stories, when you look at tests, when you use them in your everyday writing. Remember students, if you ever need to hold or pause the video so that you can keep taking notes, that's perfectly fine. Just click the pause button so that you can write everything down, because you do need very thoroughly completed notes that you have to bring to class tomorrow so that we can participate in the group activity. All right, our next concept that we're going to be learning about is action versus linking verbs. An action verb expresses either physical or mental activity. So I'm going to give you a few examples. For example, I have used a computer in math class. Please complete your homework, Juan. Yes, you, Juan. Finish it, please. For example, Brian understands the science assignment. Great job, Brian. Miss Park is thinking of a good way to teach verbs. So, I'm going to be circling the action verb phrases here. Have used, complete, understands, is thinking. All of these show action. I have used a computer in math class. They either show action or a physical or mental activity. So the first two show action. I have used and please complete. Then the next two show a mental activity. Brian understands and Ms. Park is thinking. So these are mental activities. So it can be both physical or mental activities. That's what action verbs are. Let's move on to linking verbs now. A linking verb connects or links the subject to a word or word group that identifies or describes the subject. So for example, Mr. Cole is our principal. The verb is connects principal with the subject, Mr. Cole. It simply connects. It doesn't show action. It doesn't show a physical or mental activity. So that's why it's just a linking verb. The class had appeared perfect. In this case, had appeared is our verb phrase that links or connects the word perfect with the subject class. So once again, had appeared is not an action. It's not a physical or mental activity. It simply links the subject to another word that describes or identifies the subject. So I just circled is in red because I want to show you that that is the linking verb in that first example. So it connects Mr. Cole to principal. In the second example, had appeared is our verb phrase that also is a linking verb phrase because it links or connects class with perfect. Some linking verbs from the verb be are am, is, are, was, were, has been, have been, had been, will be, shall be, may be, might be, can be, should be, and would have been. These are some linking verbs formed from the verb be. So all of these are very commonly used linking verbs. Look at those verbs. They do not show action. They do not express physical or mental activity. They simply link the subject to another word or word group that identifies or describes the subject. And last but not least, there's a few other linking verbs on the very bottom. These are very commonly used as well. Appear, smell, grow, taste, seem, feel, stay, remain, become, sound, look, and turn. These are other linking verbs. You should look at those verbs, write them down if you want in your notes, and make sure that you know them because they are very commonly used linking verbs. And the last concept that we're going to be learning about in this segment is transitive versus intransitive verbs. So we've been learning that verbs can either be action or they could be helping, they could be linking. We learned how to categorize verbs into many different ways. This is just another way to categorize the verbs that we use in our everyday language when we write and when we read and when we speak. So this is just another way to categorize the verbs that we know. So a transitive verb is a verb that expresses an action directed towards a person, place, thing, or idea. The action passes from the doer, which is the subject, to the receiver, who is the object. I know that this definition seems a little bit unclear because it is a more challenging concept. However, I believe that we can all understand it if you look at the examples carefully. And remember, if you have any questions, write them down and bring them to class tomorrow because when we work in our collaboration groups, I am going to be asking groups to ask me lots of questions so that we can understand all of these concepts very clearly. So here are some examples. Tamisha entertained the child. Lisa visited Guatemala. My cousin Julio plays baseball. Sam studies English each day. In all of these examples, there is a verb that expresses an action directed towards a person, a place, a thing, or an idea. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. So for example, in number 1, Tamisha entertained, which is definitely the verb. We learned what verbs are already. Entertained whom or what? The child. So that's what makes it a transitive verb. Lisa visited, that's our verb right there, visited whom or what or where? visited Guatemala, which means that we already have an object for our verb right there, so that makes visited also a transitive verb. The last two examples, make sure you pay close attention because we're going to see that some of the verbs can be transitive or intransitive based on how you use it in a sentence. My cousin Julio plays baseball. Plays is also a verb here. Plays what or whom? Baseball. That makes it transitive. Sam studies English each day. Studies what or whom? Well, he studies English. And that's why all of these verbs in these particular sentences are categorized as transitive verbs. Now let's look at what intransitive verbs are. Intransitive verbs tell us something about the subject or expresses action without the action passing to the receiver. So in other words, there is no object. Nothing is being passed to the receiver. So I'm going to show you what that looks like in the next few examples. The children smiled. The dogs ran across the field. I am here. My cousin Julio plays every week. Sam studies hard. The soup tastes too salty. If you look at these sentences, look carefully at where I circle and how I cannot find an object in every single sentence. Because if you cannot find an object, then it is not transitive, which means it's intransitive because there's no object. For example, the children smiled whom or what? There's nothing there. So in this case, I have nothing underlined in blue. So that makes it intransitive. Next, the dogs ran across the field. Ran whom or ran what? Nothing. It doesn't tell me what was ran. It just tells me where the dogs ran across the field, which is a prepositional phrase, by the way. But it doesn't have an object. So that's why it's an intransitive verb as well. Next, I am here. Am what or am whom? Doesn't tell me that either, so it's intransitive. My cousin Julio plays every week. Now if you notice, the word plays in the other example on the left side was transitive because he plays what or whom? Baseball. But on the right side, there is no object. It doesn't tell you what he plays. It just tells you that he plays every week. It doesn't say that he plays violin. It doesn't say that he plays baseball. It doesn't tell us that he plays Pokemon cards, okay? It doesn't tell us what he plays or whom he plays. So in this case, there is no object, and that's why the word plays in the right side here has no object. It has no object, which means it is not transitive. In other words, it's intransitive. The next example is the same thing as the last. Same word, studies. If you look on the left side, Sam studies what or whom? English. That's why it was transitive. If you look on the right side, Sam studies hard. It doesn't tell us what or whom he studies. It just tells us how he studies, right? So whenever you don't have an object, it's intransitive. It doesn't tell us that Sam studies math. It doesn't say Sam studies for PE, okay? It doesn't say that Sam studies Spanish. It just says Sam studies hard. So since we don't have a whom or a what after the verb, you do this sentence or this word is definitely an intransitive verb. And last but not least, the soup tastes too salty. The word taste is the verb in this sentence, and it is intransitive. If you remember, in some of the commonly used linking verbs that we learned earlier, taste is definitely a linking verb. And guess what? All linking verbs are intransitive because remember, linking verbs link the subject to words or a word that describes it. So soup is linked to too salty. All right, so that's the end of our presentation today. I hope that you took very thoroughly written, correctly spelled, wonderfully completed notes and that you can bring those to class tomorrow to show me so I can give you a homework stamp. Great job, students, and I'll see you tomorrow.